With the end of the state's moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, state and city officials have stepped up to offer more emergency help with housing. But several organizations have also stepped up to call for even stronger protections for renters and homeowners. Our guests are from two of those organizations. We'd like to welcome the chair of the board for the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, Joseph Feaster Jr., and the staff attorney with the Medical Legal Partnership at Lawyers for Civil Rights, Melanie Gleason. I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you very much.
And good to be connected with both of you. And I know, Joseph, we don't have as much visible, but we can certainly hear you loud and clear. I want to start with Melanie, because before this moratorium expired, we heard the warnings of a tsunami of evictions and the great eviction machine. I know it's probably too early to really tell, but I don't know if, I mean, is that actually happening, or are we missing something?
Yes. As it turns out right now, so since the state moratorium expired on October 17th, there have been data points that have been coming in already across the state where landlords have been going ahead and filing those, the first step to that process, which is called a notice to quit. They're going ahead and filing them in the housing courts all across the Commonwealth. So it's one of those things where the actual duration of time for a notice to quit in a non-payment case is 14 days. So we're in this stage where things are very much active, and then also a bit preliminary in terms of how we are seeing on the ground how this is going to really impact folks more and more, where I estimate that in a few weeks' time, we are going to have folks packed in housing court hearings and being able to determine the status of whether or not they're going to be evicted. So it's an issue that's just going to get worse and worse.
Attorney Joe Feaster, who's getting hurt the hardest with this, and how does that overlap with the pandemic?
Well, Chris, and thank you very much for this, and certainly I'm happy to be here with Melanie from the Lawyers Committee. The reality is the reason why we came together and produced that letter to speak to our legislators is because we know that both tenants and small landlords particularly are going to be affected adversely, and the situation is almost akin to what has happened with people seeking the unemployment. The whole operationalizing of that whole process has as well been difficult. And as Melanie said, yes, by next month, without the moratorium, the process will begin. Now, the reality is that right now it's difficult to get into court and to try these matters because of the COVID. So there are a number of different aspects of this that are going to be affected. COVID has created a conundrum across the board, not only with the trying to get the dollars that the state has provided or the governor has provided to the individuals, but also the circumstances of trying to get into court. And we have to be sensitive of both tenants and small landlords, because small landlords survive on their tenants' rent to pay their mortgage, pay their bills, and to keep the property up. So it is a conundrum. And what we're trying to do is to raise the alarm along with others that there's something that needed to be done from a governmental standpoint.
Melanie, there were a lot of people who were hardworking, at least before the pandemic. They've lost their jobs, but some of them are not eligible for much in the way of government benefits. So what happens with them?
Mm-hmm. So the Eviction Diversion Initiative, which is the $171 million that Governor Baker has poured into basically housing assistance at this point in time, and 100 million of those dollars are allocated towards a program called RAFT, which is short for rental assistance for families in transition. So there has been a lot of state funds that have already been funded into trying to expand these type of rental assistance programs. And with that expansion of funds actually comes an expansion of eligibility as well, namely the fact that under the previous iteration of this RAFT funding during the pandemic, families were eligible up to $4,000 of assistance within a period, and now they are eligible to up to $10,000. So there's that, as well as a longer duration of time where if there are school-age children in the residential unit, that is to be taken into consideration in terms of being able to preserve that tenancy. The issue is that although the state has been funding more money into this program, it unfortunately isn't enough. The housing advocates across the state, including folks that Joseph and I have both been working with, initially were calling for twice that amount of money to be funded in RAFT, which is around $200 million. So in and of itself, there isn't enough money to really sustain the length of time that we're going to be in this pandemic, which is not ending anytime soon. And secondly, as Joseph was saying, it's also a concern about how these programs are being operationalized and rolled out on the ground. We've been seeing from our volunteers at Lawyer for Civil Rights, as well as other community partners, that families who have applied to get raft assistance unfortunately haven't been receiving it, sometimes up to a couple months, which is just putting individuals and families farther and farther behind.
And Joseph, what about the legal landscape for prolonging a moratorium? Because it sounded from the federal court, at least, as if there was limited patience with that, maybe limited constitutionality. Is that a viable option, really?
Mm-hmm. So,
well, I think that, and I probably will look to Melanie because she's more on the legal end of that as well. But let me just simply say, to just respond very, very briefly, it's more, Chris, I think, a political component. If we're able to address a situation with the type of funding which government should supply for its citizens in addressing the payments for a period of time for tenants so that they can pay their rents, then I think that that's an option that can work and we don't get into the legal spectrum. But the reality is that that's not going to go on forever. So the real question is what happens now. I'm sure that Melanie's going to talk about the CDC moratorium, which is still into existence until the end of the fiscal year. The end of the year. So Melanie, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Yes, I think to touch upon some of the points that Joseph was just speaking about. Yes, there are really solutions here. Namely, the first solution that the Massachusetts legislature can enact right now is passing the Housing Stability Act, which it has already gone through a series of checks in the legislative process. There is really just a widespread confusion, I would say, across the Commonwealth as to why the state legislature has not had a formal session in almost 2.5 months during a time where there needs to be urgent legislation such as the Housing Stability Act passed. So that's something that absolutely needs to be highlighted. And in terms of the moratorium, as Joseph was saying, so since the state moratorium expired last weekend, we are in the Commonwealth under the CDC moratorium, which is until the very last day of the year, December 31st. And to break down the highlights of it, basically tenants in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who are at risk of being evicted, there needs to be eligibility criteria, mainly that as an individual, you make less than $98,000 a year. There's been a substantial loss of income or extraordinary medical expense. You are inevitably going to be evicted, and you've tried to obtain state or local rental assistance, as well as tried to make those rental payments and continue to try making those rental payments. So if someone is eligible under those criteria, they can apply for the CDC moratorium, which basically all they need to do is just go out and fill out a declaration. There's a form on the CDC website. It's translated into some other languages on the HUD website. They print out this form, attest that they match that criteria, and they need to hand it over to their landlord. And this process under the CDC moratorium is something that we need to really disseminate in terms of tenants' rights and ensure that folks in the Commonwealth know that they have access to this.
Joe, one of the other things I picked up when the governor called up and reactivated some judges to handle eviction cases, that he was trying to suggest that maybe they're going to look for other resolutions and not just throw people out in the street. How much faith do you have in that being the case?
Well, I mean, again, I'm going to take the governor at his word. What we have to be vigilant on, and the other groups that are involved in this, with this concern, is, as Melanie was saying, I want to underscore two aspects. One is we have to, monitor what's happening as far as the dispersing of the funds. We think that operationalizing that issue is difficult because of the pandemic, but also, a lot of state employees are working from home. A lot of the folks are in some of the CBOs, community-based organizations, they're working from home. People have to try to communicate by internet, which they don't have in many instances. So we have to make sure to look at how that system of getting the dollars to the individuals who need it happens. So we must stay vigilant with the governor and with the legislature. As Melanie pointed out, we have to make sure that the tenants know their rights, because if they are going to be going through eviction, they need to be able to know whether some of the options, whether they are eligible for the CDC moratorium defense. But as well, we're not waiting for that either. There are the Volunteer Lawyers Project, as well as the Mass Black Lawyers Association, are putting together lawyers to assist tenants through this process as well when they're facing the eviction. So, Chris, we're trying to cover this from all facets. We're trying to do the political, working along with government. We're trying to make sure we educate tenants and small landlords, and we want to make sure that if the legal aspects are necessary, that we have put together the type of resources in that regard as well to assist people through this effort.
Well, I want to ask you about resources because even before the end of the moratorium, Metropolitan Area Planning Council will put out some figures on the gap between what the resources are right now and what's needed. What does that say about what should be done going forward?
Yeah, I can jump in there. So specifically with RAFT, there has been recognition from the governor and the governor's office that this is something that needs funding. And as Joseph and I have said on several different points, this is unfortunately not an issue that's going to go away anytime soon due to the length of the pandemic and the situation that we ourselves are found in. So there has been an effort to already infuse the RAFT funds in the state of Massachusetts to 100 million. But the issue is, again, being able to really infuse it to what housing advocates initially called for, which was 200 million, in order to really ensure that tenants across the Commonwealth, as well as small landlords, have access to be able to stay afloat during what is surely going to be a treacherous winter. I was also noticing in terms of the data that the state Board of Health has been releasing, that yesterday was actually the highest number of confirmed COVID cases in the Commonwealth, 986 cases, which was the highest day in months. So this is just an issue, just with so much intersectionality with what's going on in the pandemic and otherwise, that we need to ensure that this program is being funded to keep renters where they're the most vulnerable, which is, keeping them in their homes.
And just briefly, because when you have more displacement, you have more of what epidemiologists call displacement, or should I say, migration of hazards. So that means we got a problem for public health, right?
Well, that's absolutely correct, Chris. And just before I respond to that, I want to be able to say that one of the things we're saying is, while we're happy for the 171 million in the RAFT program, as Melanie alluded to, it's just not going to be sufficient in order to address the problem. So we're looking for an increase in that. And to your point, the answer is yes, because if we do have these evictions, where do these people go? They're either going to be on the street, they're going to be in the shelters. We already know that there aren't enough shelter beds that exist. So this problem is exacerbated, and yes, we'll have a public health issue for sure if we don't find a creative way in which to address it.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for taking the time to join us.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris.
That was Joe Feaster from the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts and Melanie Gleason from Lawyers for Civil Rights. We'll have more news in just a moment.